Some of these Soviet aircraft were tiny, outdated, or just plain unconventional by Western standards, but they ended up fundamentally changing the skies of World War II, from nimble fabric-covered biplanes that refused to die, to fearless assault gliders carrying partisans behind enemy lines, to the infamous armored flying tanks that German soldiers learned to fear above all else. Fighters and interceptors. The Polikarpov I-5 was a biplane fighter that was truly ancient by the time Germany invaded in June 1941. First entering service back in 1931, it represented Soviet aviation from an entirely different era and was considered completely obsolete for modern air combat. Yet desperate circumstances meant that some units still flew these relics during the initial catastrophic defense, mainly relegated to night harassment bombing missions when darkness concealed their hopeless inadequacy against modern German fighters. Next up, the Polikarpov I-15. This tough little biplane, known affectionately as the Chaika or Seagull due to its distinctive gull-shaped upper wing, first earned its formidable reputation during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, where Republican pilots used it to challenge nationalist aircraft. When World War II engulfed the Soviet Union in 1941, the I-15 was already outdated, quickly relegated to training duties and coastal defense roles where it wouldn't face Germany's modern Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Moving on to the Polikarpov I-153. This was the legendary gull-winged Chaika, or Seagull, one of the very last successful combat biplanes ever built anywhere in the world. Introduced in 1939 with a retractable landing gear that was revolutionary for a biplane, its extreme maneuverability and tight turning radius made it a genuine menace at low altitudes well into 1942. Soviet pilots who mastered its quirks could outturn German fighters in close-quarters dogfights, though its slow speed and fabric covering made it desperately vulnerable to modern weapons. The Polikarpov I-16 was known by its pilots as the Ishak, or Little Donkey, though some called it the Rata, or Rat. This stubby, compact monoplane with its distinctive blunt nose was genuinely revolutionary when it first flew in 1933, one of the world's first low-wing monoplane fighters with retractable landing gear. By 1941, it had become the Soviet Union's primary fighter, hopelessly outmatched by German Bf-109s in speed and firepower. It took catastrophic losses during the initial German onslaught, yet it proved incredibly rugged in combat, capable of absorbing tremendous damage. Soviet pilots appreciated its sturdy construction, even as they died in it by the thousands. Next on the list, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-1. This was an early Soviet attempt at creating a high-altitude interceptor when it entered service in 1940. Unfortunately, it suffered badly from dangerous stability issues at high speeds that killed test pilots and frontline aviators alike. The fuel tanks were poorly positioned, making them prone to catastrophic fires when hit. It was quickly modified and replaced by its more famous and somewhat improved successor. The MiG-3 represented the refined version of the troubled MiG-1, entering widespread service in 1941. It remained a difficult machine to fly, demanding constant attention from pilots and unforgiving of mistakes, but it was a truly stellar performer at high altitude, excelling above 15,000 feet where its specially designed engine maintained power. This made it vital for defending key Soviet cities like Moscow from high-flying German reconnaissance aircraft. At low altitude, where most Eastern Front combat occurred, it was considerably less effective, handicapped by poor maneuverability. Moving on to the Lavkichin Log-3. Soviet pilots gave this aircraft the grim nickname Lakitovany Garantitovany Grob, the lacquered, guaranteed coffin. When it entered service in 1941, early versions were genuinely heavy and notoriously underpowered, combining poor performance with a tendency to catch fire easily. Pilots complained bitterly about its handling. However, later production batches with design improvements and better engines drastically improved its reputation, and it served throughout the war in substantial numbers. Next on the list, the Lavkichin La-5. This represented a dramatic wartime transformation that changed Soviet fortunes in the air. In 1942, Soviet designers took the fundamentally sound Log-3 airframe and successfully replaced its inadequate inline engine with a powerful Shvetsov radial engine. The transformation was stunning. It instantly became a major turning point fighter, finally giving Soviet pilots an aircraft that could meet German Bf-109s and Fw-190s on roughly equal terms. It arrived at the perfect moment during the Stalingrad campaign.
The Lavochkin Law-7 is considered by many aviation historians to be the finest Soviet piston-engine fighter of the entire war. Entering service in 1944, it was highly agile, genuinely fast, and extremely deadly with its armament of three 20mm cannons. The top Soviet ace, Ivan Kojedub, flew this magnificent machine to achieve 62 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II. German pilots learned to respect any Law-7 they encountered. The Yakovlev Yak-1 became the simple, reliable foundation of the entire Yakovlev fighter family that would dominate Soviet production. First entering service in 1940, its excellent handling characteristics, good performance, and critically, its high rate of production made it absolutely crucial for achieving air superiority during 1942-43, when the tide began turning against Germany. Over 8,700 were built, providing Soviet air regiments with desperately needed modern fighters. Next on the list, the Yakovlev Yak-3. This aircraft was incredibly light, powerful, and highly responsive, an absolute menace in close combat at low and medium altitudes where most Eastern Front dogfights occurred. Introduced in 1944, it could outturn virtually anything the Luftwaffe fielded. German pilots were specifically warned in tactical briefings to avoid engaging in turning dogfights with Yak-3s, testimony to its fearsome capabilities. The Yakovlev Yak-7 had unusual origins, initially conceived in 1941 as a tandem-seat advanced trainer. However, it proved so capable that it was easily converted into a truly effective frontline fighter with minimal modifications. Its fundamental ruggedness and good handling ensured its widespread use across the Soviet air forces throughout the war, serving in both training and combat roles. Moving on to the Yakovlev Yak-9. This became the most mass-produced Soviet fighter of the entire war, with over 16,000 built in numerous variants. Entering service in 1942, it was genuinely versatile and remarkably adaptable, serving successfully in many specialized roles, from long-range escort to dedicated tank busting with 37mm or even 45mm cannons. Its reliability and ease of production made it the backbone of Soviet fighter aviation from 1943 onward. Ground attack. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik became the legendary flying tank of Soviet ground attack aviation, the most produced military aircraft in history, with over 36,000 built. First entering service in 1941, it was designed entirely around its armored cockpit, with up to 12mm of steel protecting the pilot, engine, and vital systems. This armored bathtub allowed it to survive hits that would destroy any conventional aircraft. The Il-2 instilled pure terror in German ground forces wherever it appeared, attacking with rockets, bombs, and rear-firing cannons. German soldiers called it the Black Death and concrete bomber. Its psychological impact matched its physical devastation. Next up, the Sukhoi Su-2. This was a relatively obscure light bomber and ground attack aircraft that suffered catastrophic losses during the initial German invasion in 1941. Derived from a reconnaissance prototype and entering service in 1940, it proved inadequately protected and too slow to survive in the lethal environment of the Eastern Front. It was quickly replaced by more robust designs like the PE-2 and Il-2. The Ilyushin Il-10 became the late-war successor to the famous Il-2 Sturmovik. Introduced in 1944, this refined design was sleeker, significantly faster, and even better protected than its predecessor. It participated heavily in the final massive Soviet offensives into Germany during 1945, and then in the brief but devastating war against Japan in Manchuria. It represented the pinnacle of Soviet armored ground attack aircraft design. Light, night bombers, and trainers. The Polikarpov Po-2 was known affectionately throughout the Soviet Union as the kukuruznik, or corn duster, due to its original agricultural role. This simple biplane from 1928 was incredibly slow, barely capable of 90 miles per hour, remarkably quiet and highly maneuverable. These characteristics made it perfect for an unexpected role: night harassment bombing. The famous all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, nicknamed the Night Witches by terrified German soldiers, used this humble biplane for constant harassment raids throughout the war. Flying multiple sorties each night, often a dozen missions per pilot, they would cut their engines and glide silently over German positions before releasing small bombs, denying sleep and spreading fear. Next on the list, the Polikarpov R-1. This dated biplane design was based heavily on the British de Havilland DH-9A from World War I, license produced in the Soviet Union from 1923. It was thoroughly obsolete by the start of the Great Patriotic War in 1941, seeing only brief service in training and liaison roles in rear areas far from combat. Moving on to the Polikarpov R-5. This was a standard, genuinely rugged biplane used primarily for reconnaissance throughout the 1930s. First entering service in 1931, it was widely employed for photomapping vast Soviet territories and tactical observation. Some examples were still desperately pressed into light bombing duties during the catastrophic early months of 1941, when every available aircraft was needed. Moving on to the Polikarpov RZ. This aircraft was a modernized, slightly sleeker version of the older R-5 design, entering service in 1935. It featured an enclosed cockpit for improved crew comfort and better aerodynamics. It was mainly used for observation and light ground attack duties before the German invasion, quickly becoming obsolete once modern warfare arrived. The Yakovlev UT-1 was a very simple single-seat monoplane trainer introduced in 1936. It was specifically designed to introduce new fighter pilots to the higher speeds and handling characteristics of modern monoplanes after they mastered basic flying on biplanes. Only limited numbers were used for emergency liaison duties during the war. Next up, the Yakovlev UT-2. This became the standard tandem-seat basic trainer throughout the Soviet training pipeline. This essential aircraft, introduced in 1935, taught thousands upon thousands of pilots the fundamental skills they would need to fly the Yak and Lavochkin fighters that won air superiority. It was absolutely critical to maintain the flow of replacement pilots. The Yakovlev Yak-6 was a small twin-engined utility transport built largely from wood to conserve scarce metal. Introduced in 1942, it specialized in transporting urgent supplies, wounded soldiers, and key personnel behind the constantly shifting front lines where larger aircraft couldn't operate safely.
Frontline dive bombers. The Petyakov P-2 became the most important Soviet light bomber of the entire war. First entering service in 1941, it was genuinely fast, capable of over 330 miles per hour, highly successful, and capable of precision dive bombing that devastated German positions. Its speed made it difficult for early German fighters to intercept, and it served in enormous numbers throughout the war in multiple roles. Soviet crews called it Peshka and valued its performance and survivability. Next on the list, the Petyatov P-3. This was a dedicated heavy night fighter and reconnaissance variant of the famous P-2, introduced in 1941. It featured specialized cameras for photo reconnaissance and heavier forward-facing armament, including cannons for interception duties against German bombers. It provided the Soviet Air Force with desperately needed night fighting capability. The Arkhangelsk R-2 represented a deep modernization of the older SB bomber design. Introduced in 1940, it featured improved dive bombing capabilities and better aerodynamics with a redesigned nose. However, its frontline career was quickly overshadowed by the superior P-2, and production remained limited. Moving on to the Tupolev T-2. This excellent, high-performance, twin-engine medium bomber was genuinely superior to most contemporary designs from any nation. First flown in 1941, but delayed in entering widespread service until 1943-44, it combined speed, good defensive armament, and substantial bomb load. It became a primary Soviet bomber during the final years of the war and remained in production well into the post-war period. Medium, long-range, and heavy bombers. The Ilyushin DB-3 served as the primary Soviet long-range bomber before and during the early years of the Great Patriotic War. Introduced in 1937, it was the direct predecessor to the more famous I-4 and was used extensively for long-range strategic missions deep into German territory during 1941-1942, including early raids on Berlin itself. Next up, the Tupolev SB. This aircraft was genuinely one of the most advanced bombers in the entire world during the mid-1930s when it entered service in 1936. Its speed exceeded that of contemporary fighters, making it seem invincible. By 1941, however, it was badly aging and completely outmatched by modern German fighters. Yet it served extensively in frontline combat during the desperate early months, often incurring devastating losses as German fighters tore through formations. The Yermolayev Yer-2 was a heavy, long-range bomber designed specifically for high-altitude strategic operations. First flying in 1940, it was often plagued by persistent issues with its engines that limited its effectiveness. It participated in early, prestigious strategic bombing missions, including some of the first Soviet raids on Berlin in 1941, but never achieved mass production. Moving on to the Petyakov P-8. This was the only four-engine Soviet heavy bomber built and successfully operated in significant numbers during the war. Introduced in 1940, it was used for high-profile strategic missions and served as a potent symbol of Soviet strategic bombing capability. Only about 90 were built, but they conducted important missions, including bombing Berlin and delivering diplomatic missions. The Tupolev TB-3 was a massive, remarkably slow four-engine heavy bomber biplane from 1932. It was completely obsolete by modern standards, but incredibly durable. It was famously used as a night bomber where darkness protected it, and participated in the extraordinary Zveno fighter parasite experiments, where I-16 fighters were carried attached to the wings and released near targets. Next on the list, the Tupolev TB-1. This very early twin-engine monoplane bomber dates all the way back to 1929. It was entirely obsolete by 1941 and was strictly relegated to utility transport roles throughout the war, moving cargo and personnel in rear areas. Reconnaissance. The Yak-1R was a specialized reconnaissance version of the successful Yak-1 fighter. It was adapted with internal cameras for high-speed photographic missions near the combat zone, allowing Soviet commanders to gather tactical intelligence about German positions and movements. Next up, the Yak-9R. This was a dedicated tactical reconnaissance variant based on the highly successful and numerous Yak-9 fighter platform. It provided high-speed, protected observation that was essential for supporting the fast-moving Soviet ground offensives from 1943 onward. The Yak-9DD represented the extended range variant of the standard Yak-9. The DD designation stood for Dalny Действия, or long-range action. Introduced in 1941, it was capable of flying missions over 1,300 miles, which proved crucial for escorting American bombers operating from Soviet bases during shuttle bombing missions later in the war. Moving on to the Petyakov PE-2R. This was a specific variant of the excellent PE-2 light bomber, adapted for dedicated reconnaissance work. It carried specialized camera equipment in place of heavy bombs, allowing high-speed photo reconnaissance runs over German-held territory. Naval aircraft and seaplanes. The Beriev MBR-2 was a reliable single-engine flying boat that earned the nickname barnacle or sea cow due to its rather clumsy, ungainly appearance. First entering service in 1935, it performed vital coastal patrols and anti-submarine duties throughout the war, operating from Soviet naval bases in the Arctic, Baltic, Black, and Pacific. Next up, the Beriev KOR-1. This was a compact, short-range scout seaplane designed specifically for shipboard catalogue launches from Soviet cruisers and battleships. Introduced in 1937, it was primarily used for observation duties, spotting for naval gunfire, and providing reconnaissance for the fleet. The Beriev KOR-2 became a later substantially improved catalogue-launched observation seaplane. Entering service in 1946, but developed during the war, it was faster and more robust than its predecessor, widely used for artillery spotting and reconnaissance duties with Soviet naval forces. Moving on to the Chetverikov MDR-6. This was a fast, twin-engine reconnaissance flying boat with a very modern, streamlined design for its era. Introduced in 1943, it served extensively patrolling the vast Soviet northern and Far Eastern coastlines, providing long-range maritime reconnaissance. Finally, the Shavrov SH-2. This small, versatile amphibious biplane from 1931 was heavily relied upon for liaison work, medical transport and evacuation, and general utility duties in hard-to-reach remote areas where its ability to land on water or land proved invaluable.
Transports and utility. The Lyusinov Lee-2 was the Soviet-manufactured version of the legendary American Douglas DC-3 airliner, produced under license. Entering production in 1942, it formed the true backbone of Soviet military air transport throughout the war. It was essential for supply missions, paratrooper drops, and evacuating wounded from front areas. Over 4,000 were built in the Soviet Union. Next on the list, the Tupolev PS-84. This was the exact initial Soviet designation for the license-built Douglas DC-3 before it was renamed Lee-2 in 1942 to honor the factory director. It represented a critical military transport asset during the desperate early war period. The Sherbakov She-2 was a simple twin-engine transport designed specifically for operations from short, unprepared airstrips near the front lines. Introduced in 1943, this rugged aircraft was excellent for reliable, consistent frontline resupply missions where more delicate aircraft couldn't safely operate. Gliders. The Antonov A-7 was a medium-sized assault glider, often towed by older bombers like the SB or TB-3. Introduced in 1941, it played a vital role in delivering troops, weapons, ammunition, and urgently needed supplies to Soviet partisan groups operating behind German lines, allowing resistance forces to sustain their operations. Finally, the Gribovsky G-11. This smaller utility transport glider was designed for simple mass production, constructed mostly using wood to conserve scarce metals. Introduced in 1942, it was crucial for secretive nighttime missions, supplying guerrilla fighters and partisan units deep behind German lines, where powered aircraft couldn't safely penetrate. These were the aircraft that carried the Soviet Union from the edge of annihilation to ultimate victory. From the desperate summer of 1941, when the Luftwaffe seemed invincible and German armies raced toward Moscow, through the grinding attritional battles of 1942-43, where air superiority slowly shifted, to the final massive offensives that crushed Germany and liberated Eastern Europe. Some of these aircraft were brilliant designs: the IL-2 Sturmovik that redefined ground attack aviation, the Yak fighters that combined simplicity with effectiveness, the PE-2 that proved Soviet engineers could match anything the West produced. Others were obsolete relics pressed into desperate service, fabric-covered biplanes facing modern fighters in a war they were never designed for. Many were simply adequate, good enough to do the job with the materials and industrial capacity available to a nation fighting for its very survival. But every aircraft in this account carried people. Young Soviet men and women, for the Soviet Union was the only nation to deploy women in combat aviation roles in significant numbers, who climbed into cockpits knowing the appalling odds. The night witches flying their fragile PO-2 biplanes through flak and searchlights night after night. IL-2 pilots who pressed attacks against German armor, knowing 1 in 3 wouldn't return. Fighter pilots who took to the air in I-16s and LAG-3s during 1941, hopelessly outmatched, but fighting anyway because their nation's existence depended on it. The Soviet Union lost over 100,000 aircraft during the Great Patriotic War, a number almost incomprehensible. With them died tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, gunners, and radio operators, the youngest and bravest thrown into a meat grinder of industrial warfare that consumed lives as rapidly as factories could produce replacements. These aircraft were built in factories that had been evacuated thousands of miles east ahead of German advances, reassembled in makeshift facilities in Siberia and Central Asia, and operated by pilots who often received minimal training because there was no time. They were flown until they fell apart, repaired with whatever materials were available, and flown again. They represented Soviet determination made tangible. Crude, perhaps, by Western standards, but effective enough to help turn the tide of the most brutal conflict in human history. The aluminum and wood have long since rusted and rotted. The engines fell silent decades ago. But the cost paid by those who flew them, the nearly 28 million Soviet lives lost in the Great Patriotic War, including those thousands of young aviators, remains a debt that can never be forgotten, only honored by remembering what they endured and what their sacrifice achieved.